Today, I'm going to show you a really practical example of how I reduce my cognitive load and use encoding to learn. I'm going to be screen sharing my MacBook Pro screen and my iPad Pro so you can see the actual technique that I use which got me top grades. To do this, I'm going to be going back in time to one of my hardest exams I ever had to sit, my membership to the Royal College of Surgeons. And I'm going to be showing you how I was able to learn a huge amount of information efficiently and effectively and get top grades using a pretty unique method. Now, if you're not sure what encoding even is, I've put up a link to a video that summarizes this, so you can check that out to help build context. And I've also added a free cheat sheet guide, which you can download in the description below. And if you like this style of video, do hit that subscribe button, and let's hop into my laptop and learn some surgery. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at here is my setup. I actually like having my MacBook Pro and my iPad Pro linked up and using screen sharing mode so that I've got my iPad as a second screen. Particularly, I'm going to have multiple windows open, like a PDF main textbook I'm looking at, a question bank, and also any video material. It's really helpful having that extra screen to share things across. So I'm going to jump into the textbook that I'm using to study for this surgical exam. Now, the place that I will start is pretty obvious, but it is the contents page. And what I'm doing here really is I'm looking through and just starting to build structure and understanding what is coming up in the syllabus or the curriculum. I might also dive into things like the actual exam structure, look and understand how long the exam is, the exam format, previous past papers at this point, really just to build that kind of context and top level understanding as I start to chunk information together in my brain to help me encode it effectively. Now, in this particular example, we're going to be focusing down on surgical anatomy because that has a nice mix of both images and deeper explanations that need you to understand them at that higher level of Bloom's taxonomy and higher order thinking. So what I'll then do is I will literally just kind of skim through the book. I will look and jump through and just kind of go through maybe the first chapter on something like the thorax, and I will kind of just familiarize myself with the text and look at how they've subdivided some of the topics. So we can see here, there are things like the lungs, the bronchi, there are diagrams coming up, and as things like diagrams pop up, I'm just making mental notes because the diagrams are there to sort of help you and reduce your cognitive load by the authors of the textbook. And they obviously feel like they're important enough to include them. And this allows me to start thinking about, well, how well do I need to know those diagrams? What do they link to? And then there are also some things like call-out boxes. So things like the clinical points here on this page, for example. These are things where I can start thinking, okay, this is helping me to link information in the text to other points. Now, the other thing that I'll kind of look at as I'm skimming through is this particular book. This is the main textbook that you use to revise from for your surgical exams, but it's quite sort of bullet and fact based with a little bit of explanation around the edges. So as I'm kind of going through this, I'm also cognitively thinking, what do I know well that's being discussed and described in this text? So for example, I know the heart pretty well because the cardiovascular system is taught in medical school. I know that I can go through that. I know quite a bit of anatomy there, but I perhaps don't know how that relates to some of the deeper surgical aspects or some of the deeper surgical pathologies. And so I'm starting to think, where's the limit of my knowledge as I go through? And I'm just making a bit of a note of some of these things as I kind of skim through this. And I will literally do this real quick. We can also see in this particular text, at the end of the chapter, this is one thing I love doing, is just kind of going through and looking if they've got any worked examples, any free-form questions that they pose to you at the end. And this does two things really. So first of all, if it does give you a semi-completed or semi-solved problem, it allows you to have that scaffolding to understand how questions are asked. This is particularly helpful for subjects like maths or sciences, where you need to actually apply your knowledge and work something out from the principles you're learning. And if the authors or the teachers or whoever have actually completed some of those examples first, it allows your brain to start seeing the matrix and understand how to go about it yourself in the future. And that just takes off some of your cognitive load and speed things up and really just helps you to understand things as it's explained in an easier way. For this particular one, what I'm taking here is I know that the questions coming up in the exam are going to be very clinical based. I know that I need to know my anatomy and that's going to be tested, but I'm looking at the types of questions that come up here as well. This is plugging into one of the strategies for good encoding, which is making sure that we use appropriate active recall. And by that I mean it's appropriate to the exam that we are sitting or to the subject we are learning. So for example, If this is an oral exam, there's no point me learning from multiple choice questions. And if it's a written exam, there's no point me learning from something like flashcards. I want to be learning in the format of the exam to the correct difficulty level using the correct curriculum. So literally, this takes me all of about 5 minutes. I probably just extrapolated a little bit longer just to explain this, but I will literally just whiz through this and note down just where everything is in this text. What I'll then do is I will jump over to something like my Evernote, which is what I use for kind of centralizing my knowledge repository when I'm learning anything. You can also use things like Notion or different note-taking apps. I prefer using Evernote just because it's something that I've already, that I always use and always have done, and it's built up that bulk of knowledge. So what I might do here is I'll just jump into my Evernote, and I've got a note and a notebook here for surgical exams and surgical anatomy. And I might just start looking at something like, the thorax as one of my main headings here. I might just bang it up as the biggest heading there. And, then I can start sort of building out some things like the subheadings. Like, for example, we've got development, we've got heart and the great vessels. And I'll just start sort of writing these down as a pretty kind of like low intensity, low cognitive thing that I can do that just starts to help me structure things and order things in a really easy to remember way. And what Evernote is doing here is it's acting like a second brain. It's allowing me to download information from multiple sources and store it in the central repository. Now, one of the other tools that we'll use in a little bit when we come to testing our knowledge and going bottom up and building context from actually doing active recall questions is called Chicane, and that allows for note-taking in it as well if you're on the premium version. I'm not going to use that, I'm going to stick with my Evernote, but that again is a really great resource you can use. So whatever note-taking app you use, just stick with it and help build that context. So now we've sort of started to do that, I'm just going to kind of skip ahead because that's just taking a little bit of time to build that up. What I'm going to do now is start to generate some active recall questions. And this does two things. Firstly, it gives me some questions to come back to. Secondly, it reduces my need for any kind of note-taking or any way that kind of just passively gets me reading and using study methods that don't actually work that well from the evidence. So I want to be thinking about what I understand from the text as I go through. I want to be thinking about questions that I'm not sure about, and I want to be putting those down into my Evernote, which I can then start to build context around, start to practice, and start to add appropriate active recall to. Okay, so if I'm creating some questions, one of the things I might do here, for example, is I might say, okay, well, I've skim-read through the chapter. I know the heart pretty well, but I perhaps don't know elements around the ribs, and I don't know the intercostal spaces. That was something that came up. I couldn't really remember it. I was trying to pull on those threads in my brain and wasn't really getting anywhere. So I probably just need to focus down and look at this as an area really to draw my attention to. And again, this does a couple of things. It allows me to focus deeply on an area that I'm weak at and attack it first over other things in the book. Remember, one of my big learning techniques is you don't need to read through a book from A to Z. In this anatomy chapter, we can jump around wherever, we can look at the areas that we're weakest at, and we can kind of really focus down on the topics that we know are going to come up frequently and that we're weakest at. So for me, I know that intercostal spaces comes up quite regularly in the anatomy section of this particular surgical exam, and also links to some practical applications because I've read through this, and I also know from my experience of going through the past papers that things like chest drain insertion and clinical aspects of the ribs and the lungs are really, really important to clinical practice. So I'm going to focus down on this as something to really sort of touch on. So I'm going to make this a particular heading. I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to add that into my Evernote. And then I'm literally going to start looking at, okay, how can I turn these things into questions? So if we look at something like a typical intercostal space contains 3 muscles comparable to those of the abdominal wall, and then it kind of goes through. So here, I want to be trying to move my questions I'm creating to the highest order, but I might put down just a couple of sort of fact-based questions like, what are the 3 intercostal? I'll just format that correctly, and I'll start thinking in my brain as I'm putting this question down, do I know that? And I kind of do, actually. I understand where those come from. I have revised this before at medical school. That's basically a fact. So then as I'm creating these questions, I'm thinking with my question generation, how can I move that up to a deeper level of understanding? And so in my mind, I'm sort of pulling on those threads even without looking at my source material, in this case, the textbook. So, for this one, I might start thinking about, well, okay, I know those muscles are there, but what is their actual importance, and what is their nerve supply, and how do they sort of affect things clinically? So just even without me looking at the textbook, just with the textbook closed, still in my Evernote, I'm just going to write down that question. So I'm going to say, why are the intercostals important? And as you can see, the first question I wrote down is very much a kind of closed recall question, which would be traditionally taught via things like flashcards or multiple choice answers. This is very fact-based learning. It's at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy. Whereas the second one is much more free form. It's about explaining something, and it's about explaining something in simple terms. And so what I've done here is, just from my brain, I've pulled out this question, and now I need to start thinking about, okay, can I explain this in simple terms? Why are they important? It's a pretty broad question, but it's something that a patient may ask, it's something that a colleague may ask, it's something that I might get asked in an exam, and it's something that I need to break down. And so I then need to think, okay, can I answer this or not? And can I answer it in a good, comprehensive, simple way? And if I can't, what I'll do is I will go back in, and now that I've put this question in my mind and written it down in Evernote, the content that I'm then reading through and looking at becomes much more relevant, because my reticular activation system has been charged and it's thinking, okay, I don't know something here, I need to find it out from the text. And my brain, just behind the scenes, is starting to search for the answers to that as I go through and draw focus and relevance to the key points in the text. So as we kind of go through, I'm now looking at different things that I've highlighted that I might need to learn. So we're starting to look at, why the intercostal is important. Well, one thing here is the neurovascular bundle lies between the internal and innermost intercostal muscles. So that's obviously clinically going to be really important if we're doing any procedures. So that's one thing. And then you can see on the next page here, there's actually a diagram showing the structure. And this again is another really helpful encoding device to reduce my cognitive load. Rather than me thinking about the text or having something explained in this particular textbook, I want to make sure I'm building up models of how I'm actually thinking about this information in terms of learning it. So there's something like anatomy in this case, which is itself very visual, and surgery is a very visual thing, as is medicine as a whole when we think about patients. I now am thinking, okay, this diagram's really, really important, and it's going to help me visualize and recall things much more easily. So can I actually draw this diagram? So I'm going to jump back to my Evernote, and I'm going to put draw the intercostal bases structures. And again, as I'm writing this down, I'm thinking, can I right now draw that comprehensively? And do you know what? I probably can't. Even just looking at that for sort of 2 seconds, I probably don't actually know that well. So, maybe I could draw my lines down with my Apple Pencil. I could put in the neurovascular structures somewhere, but could I get it absolutely spot on? Don't know, maybe I could. I might back myself, but in this case, I'm not too worried about actually having a go now. I'm just starting to build out these generative questions. And again, as we sort of see with this particular section, we then go into more helpful things like the clinical points. And this is really good in terms of how this textbook is laid out, because it's allowing me to connect existing knowledge. So I have some existing anatomy knowledge. I know what the ribs are, for example. I know in principle kind of what the intercostal spaces are. I know that nerves, for example, are bad if you injure them in clinical procedures. And I know that, if you've got something like an artery or a vein, if that's injured, that's going to be badness as well in terms of surgery. So now we're building on that existing knowledge, and we're thinking, okay, what is the clinical relevance here? What might I get asked at an exam? Well, again, the key points here are insertion of a chest drain should be close to the upper border of the rib, below the intercostal space, to avoid the neurovascular bundle. So again, relating this to everything we've just touched on, we've got the diagram, we've got some of the information. I might then start thinking about the actual application of this knowledge. So again, back to Evernote and my generative questions, I might put in something like, where do you cite a chest drain? Or I might put in something like, describe inserting a chest drain, because again, that's pulling on those threads of my knowledge rather than focusing down on the fact of just where you put it, thinking about how you're putting it in, thinking about, everything from picking up the chest drain in the prep room to then going preparing it to consenting the patient, and going through that in a much more practical, meaningful way that also relates things to my personal experiences. So even, when I'm writing this question down, I'm thinking, okay, have I seen a chest drain put in? Well, yes, I have. What happened? Where did the person go? What kit did they require? What was the patient like? And suddenly that's making all of this learning much more meaningful than if I was just revising something like, what's the neurovascular bundle? Where is it? What are the intercostal muscles? From something like a flashcard. In my mind now, I'm thinking, I remember that patient, I remember that clinical case, and almost using some, again, visual mnemonics, almost like the method of Loki, where you're applying information to certain objects in familiar environments. I'm now thinking, my intercostal muscle learning is related to chest drains and clinical importance, and that's why it's relevant. That's why I need to know it. That's why my attention needs to focus on it. And that's why I understand that these are the steps involved and this is where I cite it. So again, it's building up context, building up relevance. And if I can now sort of explain any of these things back, if we look back at, why the intercostal muscle is important, chest drains need to be inserted so that they avoid the neurovascular bundle. And then I sort of start extrapolating out of that. Why is a chest drain important? What are the causes and diseases and diagnoses for when a chest drain is indicated to be inserted? Again, I might start writing down some questions here and generating them. And really, just kind of going back through, pulling on those strings, thinking about what I don't know. And if there's anything that is kind of really stumping me, if there are any terms that are really stumping me, I can just jump into somewhere like a YouTube or Wikipedia, another resource that's helping me to build kind of context and understanding around that so that I can then apply things in a meaningful way. So just jumping back to our main textbook again, you can also see, I'm also being told some other information here, like irritation of the intercostal nerves and what that causes. And it's linking again to things like the anterior primary rami of the thoracic nerves. And if I don't know that, if I haven't learned that yet, that again is starting to flag things up, pulling on these strings of understanding. And rather than just kind of, rote learning that, so rather than saying something like, irritation of the intercostal muscles is caused by what, I'm starting to think, what actually is the anterior primary rami of the thoracic nerves? How would I explain that to somebody? And that's then taking me on this kind of learning journey of going and finding context and relevance from a different chapter and interleaving something from perhaps the neuro chapter where I'm looking at some of the spinal nerves, I'm looking at some of the anterior rami, I'm understanding elements of where that comes off from the anatomy, and I'm linking this in to this particular clinical case around chest drains, around intercostal muscles. Now, if you're not a medic, don't worry, this is kind of going, quite deep into medicine here, but if you're learning something like math or you're learning something like biology, that might be just simply related to a problem that you're solving. So remember, in any kind of problem that you're given in math or biology or physics or whatever it is, or if you're learning a language, there's going to be some context that's built up. There's going to be some elements of your own personal experience that you can relate to here. In something like math, where it's very sort of equation based, you might even think, okay, when have I used this in real life? What is a relevant use case for this? So if you're learning something, say for example, like trigonometry, rather than just kind of rote learning the rules and the kind of key equation mechanics of something like your algebra, your trig, whatever it is, you can start thinking outside the box and make your generative question something like, why is this even important? What jobs use trigonometry? When would this be used in real life? And you can start actually building up meaningful, relevant information outside of your textbooks, which might be very, very math-based and really kind of stop you from building up those extra personal experiences. So now we've kind of started to build out some of these generative questions. I'm going to sort of, skip down to the end of this particular chapter just to save some time. In practical terms, I kind of go all the way through this. And as I'm going through and I'm learning different topics, I'm thinking I'm probably going to spend a couple of hours doing this. I'm not going to overload my short-term memory. I'm going to focus on creating some of those questions as a way to sort of actively take notes. I'm doing this from my desk at home. You could be doing it while there's a live online lecture playing. You might be in your lecture theatre if someone is kind of talking to you and you're writing down generative questions that you're not sure about and you're thinking about those higher order applications. But one thing that I do that's really, really cool is whenever I kind of get to the end of something, I will just kind of pause and I will think, okay, we've been talking about the intercostals for a little while. How can I just explain what I've just read? Can I remember what I've just been through. And so in my mind, or perhaps writing down, I just start to think, okay, can I relay that information back now the information isn't directly in front of me? So if we think about what we've just learned, there are 3 layers of the intercostal muscles. The neurovascular sits between the inner and the innermost, the internal and the innermost. And we know that the neurovascular bundle is important for when we cite our chest drains. And so that's kind of a basic level of knowledge, but I obviously need to build on that and get much deeper. But in terms of just quick recall of some of those principles, that's not too bad considering I haven't actually revised this for years and years and years. And at the end of the chapter here, we've got these more kind of practical questions, which is really great. So, and ironically, on this one, it's an OSCE, so an objective structured clinical exam, which is basically a practical exam for anyone that doesn't do medicine. And the scenario here is a 19-year-old male is admitted with a right-sided spontaneous pneumothorax. He has a past medical history of being treated for coarctation of the aorta and requires a chest drain. And question number 1 is literally describe the anatomy of a typical intercostal space. As you can see, I'm using appropriate active recall questions, in this case from the textbook itself, where I'm thinking back to how I learned these topics, I'm thinking back to the actual page, and as you can recall, in the textbook itself, I'm imagining that diagram of the intercostal space, I'm imagining my page of Evernote with my generative questions, and I'm thinking, how can I explain this in simple terms? And then as you see, again, these are some really good examples here. Why is this knowledge important in your technique of insertion of an intercostal drain? What is the triangle of safety when inserting a chest drain? Now, for something like this, we're not necessarily going to know all the answers, and the questions themselves are probably going to pose some concepts that we don't know or we haven't learned yet, because we're going and diving directly into some of the key topics we're finding the toughest, which is the most efficient way to learn, in my opinion. But if these things come up like, triangle of safety, and let's just say, for example, you have no clue what that is, well, you might then simply just say, okay, I don't know that question's really hard. Let's just pop it in my Evernote. Let's copy that, let's pop it in. It's related, to what we're learning here, so it stays in the same subcategory and schema, which is sort of building things up. And suddenly I've got this new concept, which is triangle of safety, related to chest drain, which is in turn related to intercostals, which is in turn related to thorax, which is in the anatomy section of my surgical MRCS revision. So I've got that context built up. And now what I might do is, I might just take that word triangle of safety, plug it into YouTube, watch a video around someone inserting a chest drain, looking at some diagrams on, say, for example, if I in fact just sort of pop this into Google, hit triangle of safety, and immediately Google Images, lowest cognitive load. What are we looking at here? Okay, we've got some relationship around some of the muscles. We've got a couple of other things with text-based explanations. And because I know that your visual and your auditory cognitive loading systems are separate, I'm also thinking, okay, I can maybe jump into a video here or some audio to help sort of spin things up, as well as looking at some of these diagrams. So now we've done that, the final piece of the puzzle here is really to get in and do your past paper questions and get through some questions that are, again, relevant to you from external materials. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to jump into, again, something called Chican, lots of other online question banks available, or past papers if you got hold of them. This one's pretty cool. It's got a lot of kind of surgical anatomy materials. And one of the things I like about this is you can actually customize your learning, customize your revision. And I can jump into kind of single player or multiplayer mode here if I'm wanting to learn with other people. For me, I'm going to go into single best answer type questions. I'm going to stick with medicine. I'm going to pull in a little bit of kind of finals and anatomy questions here. And then you can see I can sort of focus down and get a bunch of these sort of applied questions that I need to know for my exams. I can then sort of set it up to be kind of gamified, set myself a question limit to make it a bit more challenging for me. And I'm probably just going to do about, 10 or so questions at the moment. Let's just do, 15. And I can actually set things up here to make things easy for me and, again, reduce my cognitive load, like plugging in spaced repetition or just focusing on the questions that I got wrong the last time to help me build more relevance. I can also decide whether I do this as an actual exam, so a formative test on the system, or I can jump in and actually look at the explanations. So for me, I want to see the explanations because I'm building that context up and I want to learn as I go along. So we hit start revision. I'm then going to go into the system. It gives me a countdown and I can see I'm presented with a clinical scenario here where someone's coming in with some coffee ground vomit. So again, it's jumping into things we haven't yet learned, but that's great. And it says, which of the following gives the most sensitive guide to the severity of GI hemorrhage? So, just real quick, maybe we want to look at something like hemoglobin. Is that correct? No, it's not. So actually lying and standing blood pressure. And it gives us a really long explanation here, which we can also kind of relate back to. And one of the cool things this system does, which is why I quite like it, is you can also bookmark these questions. So if you got something wrong, you can bookmark it, you can link it to your notes in the actual app itself, and then you can kind of connect that up to your Evernote at a later date. So this is kind of super helpful. So we could do that. We could sort of add a note here as well if we want, set it up by a category, and a lot of this organization and chunking is then done for us automatically. So I can then kind of go through this and jump into sort of a bunch of different questions. I won't do that now just to kind of save time, but you get the picture that if I'm in the library, my kind of steps here are, I'm looking through the book and skimming it. I'm creating context by setting up my notes for Victory. I am diving into the source material and looking for any worked examples and generating my own questions around the source material that I can then come back to and make the actual process of note-taking and learning meaningful. And then I'm jumping in directly to things like past papers rather than holding those off to the end that most people do. And I'm learning as I go along. And then I'm jumping between all those methods to really kind of build context as effectively as possible. And one of the nice things, again, you can do when you jump into your past papers or you jump into anything you're kind of learning is you can basically look back through your logs with any digital systems like this on screen at the moment, and you can see where you're weakest and strongest. So, for this one, we got 2 answers wrong. This kind of saves to our progress area. We can, retry this particular session at a later date, or we could view the actual questions themselves if we want. So, just to kind of summarize that back through, what I'm doing there is I'm really reducing my cognitive load by building structure, by generating my own questions, by creating topics myself, and questions around those topics which I found relevant, and I'm relating them to my personal experience. And then I'm actually just really getting kind of stuck in, and I am using existing question banks to reduce the load. Final thing here is I'm making sure I take breaks. I'm making sure I understand that if I'm sleep deprived, I'm not going to be learning or consolidating that information, and I'm spacing things out, so I'm not trying to cram and do everything all at once. So hopefully that was really helpful. That was just a really quick deep dive into how I apply some of these encoding techniques we've been talking through in some of the more theoretical based videos. I'm going to be spinning out lots more of these, so if you do find them helpful, do hit that subscribe button. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I hope you found it relevant, and we'll also put up the end cards to some of those other videos. So again, you yourself can build context about how to learn, which is really one of the most important skills.